Nancy D'Amici. I'm the chairman of this ad hoc committee. Also with me are fellow committee members Mary Teicholtz and Ben Cheese, Wayne Shepherd from the mayor's office, Dan Garrick from the finance office, Dr. Lori Weinstein, the petitioner, and Dr. Cosmo Scarlata.
That's it, right, exactly.
And members of the public.
Okay. Right, Mary.
The charge of this committee is to decide whether or not to set aside $2,800 from this year's budget for the Danbury Historic Properties Commission to carry out a specific project with the hope of a reimbursable grant. So I think to start, Dr. Weinstein, why don't you tell us a little bit about the project and about the grant?
Okay, this is, we are a certified local government, which is through the National Park Service. It's taken us many, many years to become that, and this goes back to 2002 when I first approached the mayor about doing something with historic preservation, and then I was in touch with various officials at the state level and working with Dennis Alpern, Robin Edwards, and a variety of other people who are no longer on our committee, but Mary has been on the committee from time immemorial till we pushed ahead. We created the historic property ordinance, and we went through the state and then eventually the federal government to become a certified local government. And what that does is it allows us to apply for grants to do historic preservation projects. The thing that we would love to do the most, but which is extremely costly at this point, is to restore the murals in the the old library. Because we didn't get the money for that, and that would have been a matching grant that we would have had to have found $60,000 somewhere to match with the CLG monies through the National Park Service. That project cost something like $136,000, so we could have, we need to apply for matching grants for that. This much smaller monies that we're applying for are $2,800, and they're totally reimbursable. And it's a pretty straightforward kind of program. Mary Dunn, who's the architectural historian and is in charge of the grant program through the state, has been coaching us all along. She's really favorable about this. It's a very small grant, and it would be to do a survey of prehistoric sites in prehistoric sites throughout the city of Danbury. And Dr. Cosmo Scarlata is really good at putting together GIS maps and predictive maps and things like that. And before I turn the floor over to him to explain what it is we're going to do, let me just say that this would help in terms of planning and zoning, because if we knew where sites were likely to be found, Dennis or whoever is the director of planning could look at this map and figure out site sensitivity. This would have helped us immeasurably when it came to the Lee Farm site, because that turned out to be a big mess in terms of, trying to preserve open space as well as, allowing the Army in. But if we had a map like this, they could have looked at it and said, wow, maybe we need to do some rigorous archaeology here, some sort of testing. And this would also be a great project for our students to be involved in this. And like I said, it's not even a matching grant, it's reimbursable. And I know Mary Dunn would do everything she could for us to make sure we got this grant. And then lastly, the last thing I'll say is that the main bulk of this money is going to be used for postage. Because what we need to do is send out to residents of the city some sort of mass mailing that would say, have you found any artifacts on your property? What have you found? Would you allow us to interview you? Is it possible we could even come on your property and do a very mini archaeological dig? So it would be on a volunteer basis. And this would be a really good way for the whole city to get involved in historic preservation, knowing what's here, really wanting to preserve their past. We just came from a meeting with the Danbury Historical Society. You know, we're talking about creating some sort of a connection with them. You know, if people got more involved in history, and it would help them out, it would help the Danbury Land Trust and all these wonderful organizations that all have a common purpose here, so. And I'm gonna let Kaz talk a little bit about the technical aspect of this.
What we want to produce is we want to produce a map that, you know, will identify high sensitivity areas for prehistoric archaeological sites. And, you know, at the same time, we'll try to narrow those areas down as much as possible so that, you know, not a lot of time and, you know, effort is expended in, you know, areas that maybe are not as much sensitive. To produce that, we basically just look at known site locations and we enter that data into the GIS. And with GIS nowadays, it's very easy to look at environmental variables, which are predictors of, you know, the locations of archaeological sites. And, you know, often there's good common sense reasons why people made campsites or different things in the areas where they did. So it's, you know, often very possible to take this known information and, you know, produce fairly, you know, accurate, predictable map. And the point would be, if you've got a map and it, you know, pretty much straightforward tells you where you're most likely to have important, you know, prehistoric resources as opposed to not, it's very easy to look at that map if, you know, any type of development or any types of issues come up, and you can readily see, you know, that if that particular area is going to, you know, be an area which is very likely to impact, you know, important prehistoric resources. The other component of this, you know, is to find out from people in Danbury, you know, their knowledge of prehistoric sites. You know, does anybody have artifacts sitting around in their shoebox? Does anybody know any stories? And to compile that information and to try, and in that sense, to try to begin to build the prehistory of Danbury itself. And also to get the community involved, because I think it's very important. Until you get the community involved, there's usually not a lot of, you know, community support for, you know, laws or mandates that would protect archaeological sites. And, you know, and also if important prehistoric resources did come up, you know, if we have that kind of connection with community members, there's more of an opportunity, you know, and then that, you know, to be able to get permission, perhaps, you know, to go on private land from a landowner if there was, you know, really something important out there that we want to try to look at.
We'd be creating a map like this, right? You've got all these other planning maps here. We'd create one that shows archaeological, you know, potential and known archaeological sites, but we wouldn't want to put such detail on the known ones that people would come along and, you know, start digging illegally in someone's property.
Mr. Garrett, can you comment on the grant? The worry here is whether or not the grant, you will get the grant, because it is a reimbursable one, so the city would have to put out the money in hopes that you receive the grant. So is there any way of getting some sort of guarantee before we dish out the money?
Well, I'd have to see exactly the language on the grant, but basically the process that we would recommend for finance is obviously request council approval for the grant submission, just like we do with any other grant. That, you know, you come to the finance department for that. At the same time, you can request a budget transfer, possibly from contingency or you know, any other account that the council would want to take that from. But we would recommend that we freeze that account until we receive approval from for that grant.
So that is
so we're not
possible.
actually spending it, because more than likely they're going to ask if we have those funds appropriated for that. But again, without seeing the grant documents.
So it's acceptable to put aside the money, excuse me, on the condition that the grant is approved.
Right.
Okay.
What I could do is have Mary Dunn from the state talk to you about this.
Okay.
And she's more than happy to do that because she's offered her services many times. because she's in charge of this. And this is the grant application. It's pretty straightforward.
Okay.
Okay,
If you like,
do the committee members have any questions? Ben?
If I may, to the chair. Again, I think this is a good idea to do the study, but like, again, it always boils down to dollars and cents, unfortunately. But now, you stated that I know you only asked for $2,800, which seems to be a little given the size of our city. So do you know what the total cost of this, to do this would be?
Many of these resources are just available to us at the college. I mean, I basically am an archaeologist, and I do a lot, the GIS itself is at the college, and a lot of our interest in this is just to be able to get students involved in doing a project. So, as far as the technology is right there at the school,
we have an
And,
expert here.
So this would be like a partnership with Wisconsin, so to speak.
Yeah.
Student-
the
it'd be
students would be
students.
involved, and that's kind of the thing is, as a teacher, you want to have, the projects your students can be involved in, and they can learn the GIS, and especially I'm interested in them learning about, predictive modeling and trying to identify, why people would choose certain areas for sites, and, it's all kind of a learning process for them.
And we're volunteering our time.
We know that feeling.
If I may continue.
Sir.
Going back to the actual grant application. Now, your request, again, this is a reimbursable grant. Does that mean the city has to expend the dollar to get the dollar reimbursed? Or will or we just have to tell the grant that we have set aside $2,800, and then the state
You
will
have-
actually release the $2,800?
You have to spend the money in order to get the money back, to keep copy of the receipts. However, it's pretty easy because all we're using the money for at this point is for postage. So it's probably gonna be one receipt, or maybe several receipts from however many mass mailings we do.
But will we know, but the grant will be approved? You'll know that ahead of time that they approved the reimbursement?
Before we send it out,
Before you send it, before you actually spend the dollar?
yes.
You'll actually know that you got the approval? from the
Yes.
state. Okay.
I do have a question. Is this grant time sensitive? Do you have to have the application in by
No.
a certain date?
Sooner the better in these economic times, huh?
With the project, the goal is to come up with some sort of a map that reveals high sensitivity areas. If you find some prehistoric site on someone's private property, is that going to inhibit their ability to
No.
do what they want with their property?
No,
No,
not
there's
at all.
there's, any archaeological site on private property, people on the property own the site, the resources. The only time that, there's any type of ability to, kind of go higher up and look at a site is if it's on state property or something
Or
like that. So
federal
people,
property.
it's up to the individual people how, whether they want to be able to share information, but there's no way of, there's no.
And do you plan on using your resources, your own resources, to come up with the final product, the map?
Yeah.
Yeah,
So there won't be any requests from the city with this project?
we're using our own resources. The map may not be quite that large. We may have sections of maps, we'll see. But yeah, we'll put together something the city can use. Like Cosmo said, we want to involve our students in this, so I already involve students. They've been with me in various aspects of the Historic Properties Commission. And I actually have students working on updating the files on the Danbury Downtown Historic District. We're creating a fusion table, thanks to Brian Stevens, our archivist at Haas Library, to update all those old records. So, we've been involved all along.
Any more questions from the committee? For the record, ex officio Don Taylor from the
I
council.
think she already put it in. Thank you. Thank you. Through the chair, two one positive, one unnecessarily negative. I like the idea that it's going to involve, West County, it's going to involve historical society, it can involve the library, you can even get down to the high school level, and I like that wide support. I do have a concern that, Mary voiced. I know we were working on a development project that was alongside a cemetery, and there were some issues, legal issues about boundaries and everything else. I'd like to get an opinion from the, from Corporation Council on the actual legality of what happens if it's not like an Endangered Species Act or something like that. If a site is actually found somewhere, what is the impact on the property owners? I don't know. But I know we did have issues, working near the old Great Plains Cemetery on a piece of Farm Bureau land. So I just like to have clarified that it's not going to impact the property owner if they voluntarily say, come onto my property, and we find a site, and all of a sudden, they're restricted of working so far from this site, or they can't disturb this site. I just like a clarification of that.
We can't say anything.
Oh, I know,
It's all,
but
it's
you
all
know-
voluntary.
yeah. But as soon as you volunteer something, sometimes it goes beyond that. So I just like a legal, opinion on what would happen if a property owner, voluntarily brought a survey onto their property and found a historically valuable site, how that would affect that property owner.
Can I clarify here, though? What we're doing, we're not actually, necessarily, looking at people's properties. To develop this map, we're looking at known locations of sites on the state files. And actually what we're doing is going outside of the Danbury area to create a predictive area because there's not a lot of identified. So for the making the map itself, we're not actually looking for any sites, especially on private property. My knowledge of the laws, and I can only speak for what I'm fairly sure,
Right.
is that the only time that people have any kind of obligation is if human remains are found on their property.
Okay.
Other than that, there's my knowledge of it is that there is absolutely nothing anyone can do to force you to
That's
allow
not-
people to excavate, or even if there are artifacts there, you own them, you don't have to give them unless it would be involved with Native Americans themselves, something that was but I believe it would be human remains, and possibly it's something that was some kind of important ceremony or object.
Right.
Native Americans
But I
themselves.
think we need a clarification on that.
No, that's
for-
true. I
yeah.
mean, there's a whole bunch of primarily federal and some state laws, but those only pertain to state and federal lands or state and federal monies. If a homeowner was going to have a highway ramp built through their land, then that would call into question anything that we found. All right? So the only time their stuff, what's in the ground, is going to be a problem for them is if they have federal or state monies or projects that somehow come on their land, or as Kaz said, human remains are found there. Then you have to call the state archaeologist, the police. I mean,
Right,
that's
it's
one.
complicated. Yep.
Right, I mean, our general thing is we're really not gonna be doing that much digging or things like that. The survey component of sending out these things is additional to all the other stuff we're doing for free, which is, we've already started this. We've been up at the state, up at Storrs, Connecticut with the state archaeologist, looking through old site reports and things of that nature. So we're putting together all this data. As Kaz said, that's from around Danbury. So the survey stuff that we do by, surveying some of the public, again, that's voluntary, is ancillary. It's important, but it's ancillary to, it's just one of the major, one of the steps, right?
Thank you.
Mr. Shepherd, do you have anything to
Yeah,
add?
if I could ask a question.
Of course.
The mayor tells me I have selective hearing. Did I just hear you say the mailing is going outside of Danbury?
No,
No,
not
no.
the mailing. When we create the predictive model, we're going to include Danbury will be within a region, but what I'm talking about is we're going to identify site locations that are already recorded on the site files and look at the environment and create a model based upon that. That's nothing to do with the mailing. The mailing we're going to send out is within Danbury.
Specifically, how are you going to define who gets that mailing? because you're not gonna go to 76,000 residents with $2,800.
Probably for the most part, we're going to try to mail not, into the, particularly urban areas. Probably we're going to have to sample to some
Yeah.
extent. But, a realistic sample, where we can get some kind of idea what the universe out there is.
Okay, get through the chair. Just following up on Councilman Taylor's thought. Given the Lee Farm project, now you were lobbying that there were archaeological sites on that piece. Now, if they did find items on that land, would that have prevented the Lee family from selling that piece to the federal government?
No,
It would not have.
no.
So if
The only thing that it could, depending upon what was found there,
just like non-human remains, just like
Right.
Indian heads, just, things like that.
what happens with the law, because it's Department of Defense is, so it's federal government, right? What happens is that they have to do archaeological planning, goes through 3 phases. First phase is a background study and some survey. The second phase would be doing some testing, subsurface testing, digging what we call test pit. And if they found a lot of stuff and all the information said, yes, this is really important, then they would go to a phase 3, which is much more intensive. But you work with the state historic preservation officer on that, you work with the federal government on that. So I guess what I'm saying is that this is well beyond anything we're doing. That's a whole other kettle of fish, basically. Where our project would come into that, let's say none of this had happened yet, is that we could have said, oh, there are some known archaeological sites. So when the federal government first started to get involved in this, they could work with our state historic preservation officer up in Hartford, and they could say, look, this map suggests that at this property, we have some known sites or potential sites. Therefore, let's make sure we do a really good phase 1 and possibly a phase 2. That's all that would have happened. It would have been helpful had that stuff been there ahead of time so that it would have been more straightforward. And I think the archaeology ended up getting a little messed up initially because no one knew what was going on. And that's not the fault of Danbury, it's just what was happening outside of Danbury.
Because I know, again, through the chair, there were some, again, along the Still River, which is always a big archaeological site. Down by the Beaver Brook area, there was a known Indian encampment at that point in time. And what would happen is they did develop the pieces knowing that there were, arrowheads in that site. So it did not prevent them from actually building what they wanted to build. But I think this map would have at least alerted them to what was there, which would have caused the state to come down to make sure those sites are not disturbed. Or at least what they find is actually removed and placed in a museum or something, so not just to bury it over. Is that what this would
Are you
do?
talking about Candlewood Lake in
No.
Beaver Brook?
No.
Beaver Brook was a private development, correct?
Beaver Brook Road did,
Right.
along the Still River.
Okay, I know what you're talking about. No, because as long as it's private development and private money,
Regardless, so, and if you identify the site,
I guess what would happen in that case is maybe the state archaeologist would try to come down and talk to the people about, hey, you want to do some archaeology ahead of time. Because I've worked on projects, and I'm sure Kaz has, where the landowners voluntarily wanted us there because they knew this stuff was important. They got to keep the artifacts, it was their property. So, it wouldn't halt anything. What we're planning isn't halting anything, it's just a planning.
And you're hoping to discover some new sites.
No, actually, the map itself is just to identify high sensitivity areas so that people will be aware, of where, there's likely to be impact to sites.
The subsurface testing we do in the surveying is to help us confirm whether how accurate our map is that we're creating. we put in the topographic features, like nearness to water, elevation, there are a whole variety of things that causes looking at. So this will just help us narrow in on those things that seem to predict where prehistoric sites can be found.
I think
So the
that,
practical, what I'm trying to get at is the practical application of this whole study from a citizen's point of view
Okay.
is
Sorry.
to, just to know that there might be something there on this property, so if I wanna develop it, maybe I should dig around a little bit first.
well, I mean, the degree to which, you know, important cultural resources can be protected is the degree to which there are already town laws in place that provide for protection of sites. There are federal laws whenever there is federal funding or federal grants or permits involved. It all depends to the degree to which the town of Danbury has any kind of laws in place, as an entity that would protect sites. But at least where federal projects are concerned, it would be useful because of the fact that you'd have some kind of idea beforehand that there would be sites there.
I think that this is getting more complicated than we need to be.
Yeah, but I'm just trying to,
All right, there are
I'm
two,
just
I
trying to
think there
figure
are
out
three
the
levels.
point of the whole
Or s-
project
all
from
right.
the city's point of view, since you're asking the city for them.
Right, from the city's point of view, it's like creating another map. So when development comes in, private, public, however that development comes in, there's just another thing you look at, just like you look at wetland maps and things of that nature, that tells you where prehistoric sites might be. Another aspect of this is, since we're trying to make linkages with the Danbury Historical Society and the Danbury Historical Preservation Committee that, I chair and all of this, is that it makes people aware of our past, who we are, where we came from, and gives people pride, as citizens in all of this. And we're all trying to help each other, look at Danbury and say, wow, this is really cool. Look what we've got here from, the Revolutionary War period, on back thousands of years ago. So I think that's the other practical application. Plus another practical application is that you're working with WestCon and taking advantage of our technology and our expertise and people like Kaz, who's a really good teacher there, to, serve as sort of a teaching laboratory for students to create these kinds of maps and use all these technologies that they're gonna need to know how to use in the workplace, in this changing economic times. So I think those are some of the things, just a few.
Do we have any more questions or comments?
And it's not a lot of money and it's reimbursable.
Do we have a motion?
I do have a motion, I hope. Motion to recommend to authorize the finance director to establish and reserve $28,000 on behalf of,
No,
No,
only
I'm sorry,
Too many zeros. Okay.
Quick, let's go.
We're just collective hearing now. You woke right up there.
Hold on, let me add these zeros. Okay, I'm gonna start again. Strike that motion. Motion to recommend to authorize the finance director to establish and reserve $2,800 on behalf of the Historic Properties Commission, only to be released at the time of grant approval, and follow reimbursement procedure as specified by the Department of Finance.
Do I have a second?
I want to just make a motion that come from contingency.
Yes, we can add that in to come from contingency. Is that correct, Dan?
Yep.
From contingency.
So the motion.
Want me to read the whole thing again, I think?
All right.
I'll second that.
Okay, any discussion on the motion?
Okay, so does that meet the finance director, that meet your approval, motion, the way it's stated?
Do you want to read it again, Mary?
Yeah, I'm just a little confused on, you said established and reserve or established unreserved? A reserve.
A reserve.
Why don't you read it
And
again?
reserve.
A reserve, okay.
Is that correct? Or
Uh,
a reserve, should it be a reserve?
technically, it's not a reserve.
Okay, what
It
would
would
it
be
be?
a,
Budgetary line item,
right,
Okay,
yeah, that's the best way,
so we'll establish a budgetary line item
right.
in the name of the preservation historical,
Right.
only if it meets the approval of the state.
Can you read it again for me, Mary, please?
I will try.
Thank you.
Motion to recommend to authorize the finance director to establish a budgetary line item of $2,800 from contingency on behalf of the Historic Properties Commission, only to be released at time of grant approval and follow reimbursement procedure as specified by the Department of Finance. Is that good?
Yep.
And I would again second that motion.
Any discussion on the motion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Say aye.
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 Motion to
Motion
adjourn?
carries unanimously. Motion to adjourn? Yes,
Motion to
from
adjourn.
Mary, seconded. This meeting's adjourned.
Thank you very much.
Well done.
Thank you, everyone, for